The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the Man from Lang. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, we have another spoiler for you from the Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator expansion that will be released in the new year. We are going to spoil Hank Samson's deck building options, Hank being the new Survivor Investigator who will be released in the Investigator expansion. I am joined by my co-hosts over at the Great Old Ones Gaming Podcast. If you enjoy the Arkham Horror LCG as well as RPGs, check out the link to the podcast in the description below. A big thank you to Fantasy Flight Games for the spoilers. They are greatly appreciated. Obviously, there are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Before I get started, I'd like to thank the patrons of this channel for their tremendous support. You all rock. If you'd like to be amazing like these people and support the channel's goals and see your name on this list, head over to patreon.com, sign up for a tier of your choice, and claim your rewards. That would be awesome. Special thanks to Cole Monroe Chitty, Nicole Fiscus, and Nate Lost in Time and Space for their contributions to the channel. I couldn't do it without you. Without further ado, let's get started. Hank Samson is the farmhand. He has 3 willpower, 1 intellect, 5 combat, and 3 agility. The assistant and warden trait. You may be assigned damage and horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. And as a response, when you would be defeated by damage and or horror, instead heal all of your damage and or horror and swap this card with its bonded resolute version, either side face up. His other sign effect is +1, and he has 5 health and 5 sanity. Any thoughts on basic Hank?
The ability to take damage for anyone is pretty cool, and obviously, as we will discuss later on, that very much plays into what Hank wants to be doing. So having that ability just on lockdown from the very get-go is really nice to have on an investigator like this, especially one with 5 combat. That's no joke in Survivor.
Really,
you think
really
about
good.
hitting something with a baseball bat,
But that intellect, oh my lord. At first look, he looks pretty fragile, but then once you read him, it's like, oh, he probably has more health and horror than pretty much any other investigator when you factor in that he flips and then he heals everything.
One thing to note about that too, I was doing a little bit of digging around in the card pool this morning before we started recording. Hank can completely tank a Beyond the Veil for someone and then just shrug it off. It's just hilarious.
You're right.
It leads to really interesting situations. Like, even if you think about cards like Painkillers and Smoking Pipe, right? Like, someone's sitting there with smoking their smoking pipe, and then Hank's like, can you not do that? Like, no, it's good for me.
As we will see, Hank has a very Guardian-esque ability on his basic version, where he can tank damage and horror for other allies and investigators. And then once he's taken enough to die, you will get the second version of Hank, and you have 2 choices. So I'm curious to find out from you guys, are you trying to kill Hank as quickly as possible, or are you going to try to hang on to basic Hank for a while and then have him die mid to late game rather than trying to make the switch immediately?
I think it depends on how you build him, because if you don't have other ways to, like, his combat is really good, so if you want to just put a bunch of cards that help you get clues, you're pretty much set, and you want to keep him like this. If you're playing solo, let's say, try to keep him alive as long as possible, and if you're killed and then you switch to one of his other faces, cool, no big deal. But if you're playing with other players, it really depends on the group makeup.
I think to answer your question, Man from Lang, to kind of go on Vase's point, I think it does really depend on how you decide to build him, because as we'll see later on, his other sides are really fragile, and you have to kind of play around that. I think it's similar to Calvin in that aspect, where Calvin wants to take a good amount of damage and horror, but then there's a point where he goes, no, thank you. And I think Hank can be very much in the same way. If you're building for one particular resolute side, you might be okay with staying on base Hank for a while, but if you're building towards the other one, then you probably want to find a way to take a bunch of damage and horror pretty quickly. And I think Another question you have to ask yourself is, are you taking an even spread? Like, are you trying to take like 4 damage and 5 horror, or are you trying to just quickly like take 5 damage?
Also, if you built Hank with a lot of allies, then you're not as worried about flipping him, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because you can still assign. You can't be healed. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you can still assign damage to your allies. Whereas if you didn't build them with a lot of allies in mind, then you're going to hold on to that first iteration for as long
Mm-hmm.
as possible, because once you flip, like Nate said, you're really fragile at that point if you don't have a way to mitigate that damage and horror.
I was just going to say, both of you brought up the concept of building your deck around one of the Resolute side. I don't know why, but when I think about his main ability or his main stats and then what he turns into, I think of situational. Like, I would play him as his regular side with the deck built around him. And then if we see that we need more fight power because the enemies are tough, I would then go that way. But if we need more clues, or I need just a little bit more dexterity, maybe I would go the other route. So I agree that for the most part, you would want to probably skew towards the way you've built him. But I would also say, if I see that he's just really needed a different way, that way he'd be more of a reactive hero that you could morph into what the situation calls for. Does that make sense?
And I think to kind of a similar extent to Man from Link's question is like, how do you deal with trauma, right? Like,
Yeah.
are you trying to actively take trauma so that you can transform even faster? Or are you trying to stave off trauma so that you can stay on Hank's normal side for longer? And I think that's kind of a question you have to ask yourself when you build a Hank deck. I think thematically, though, it's really cool, right? Like, Hank is this investigator who asks first and then asks questions later. And, his gameplay really kind of reinforces this, do stuff now and think about it later. And you have this, like, gameplay loop where you're thinking about, do I transform into this side or this side? And that's really cool. That's something we haven't seen in an investigator before.
Yeah, one of the reasons I asked the question is because I know in some games I've played, if you have the intention of playing, say you build your deck with the intention of playing with one or the other of Hank's Resolute versions, you may end up in a scenario where it's actually kind of difficult to kill yourself the first time. If you say he has 3 willpower, so he's pretty good at resisting traditional willpower treacheries. So you may not, if you pass some tests, taking enough horror might be an issue. And if you run into enemies, obviously he's got the 5 combat so he can kill them. But if you don't draw any enemies, then you're not, like, if you want to kill yourself, you could take a bunch of attacks of opportunity. That would certainly do it. But if you don't necessarily draw the enemies quickly enough, it might not be as easy to flip Hank as it seems with his 5 and 5. So once you flip Hank, you have the choice of 2 bonded Resolute versions. The first of those is the Assistant. His stat line changes to 3 willpower, 3 intellect, 4 combat, and 4 agility. Assistant and Resolute trait bonded to Hank Samson. You cannot be healed. You may be assigned damage and horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. And as a response, when 1 or more horror is placed on you, draw 1 card. His Elder Sign effect is +1, and you move 1 horror from Hank Samson to an asset you control. He has 4 health and 6 sanity. Thoughts on the Resolute or the Assistant version of Hank?
I think any investigator would kill to have that stat line. First
Super
off.
balanced stat line, really strong. Dark Horse is gonna boost him to a godlike level.
Yeah, Dark Horse seems really good in a build like this.
Yeah.
He also gets the ability to draw cards, which is really
Huge.
useful in Survivor because they don't have a lot of ways to draw cards. They have a lot of ways to recur cards
Yeah,
they've
good point.
already drawn.
Yeah.
But if you need new cards, that's actually kind of a challenge in Survivor. Getting that extra couple of card draws could be pretty useful too.
Yeah.
6 sanity is It's enough. It's probably going
Yeah.
to be enough, especially with the 5 that you already have on your
You've
base
already
form.
taken, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you're really at 11
Yeah.
if you choose this side. That's
Yeah.
really, really good.
And 9 health, right? That's a lot. He's very tanky, but
Yeah.
that comes with the caveat that you can't be healed once you're on your resolute side. So you have to, be careful with the sorts of, skill tests that you're going to take. But I think it's interesting because Hank can kind of lean into, more risky skill tests, right? He might be willing to take a rotting remains at +1 over +2 because he's kind of okay with taking an extra horror so that he gets to his resolute side a little faster.
Yeah.
Whereas once you're on this resolute side, now you have those extra cards that you saved from those previous skill tests because you didn't commit them earlier. But having 3
Also-
intellect on a survivor is pretty good too.
That is really good. And you can build around that. So what we were talking about earlier, like if you built around lots of skill cards that boost your intellect or cards that'll help you get more clues, then you can try and get to this sooner and leverage those type of cards and not worry so much about combat, because your first phase initially you had a 5 combat, so you were able to get by, and then now in the later half of the scenario focus on getting all the clues and investigating after you've killed enough creatures. Earlier you mentioned smoking pipe. I think painkillers would be great here, even though you can't heal the damage. You can deliberately just take a horror just to draw cards by using the smoking pipe as a free action. I mean, not smoking pipe, the painkillers. Just pop those painkillers. They don't do anything to Hank, but he draws cards,
Which could be useful, You're turning a card that is kind of already useful in Hank into a draw 3. That's not bad.
For 1 resource. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you combine this with the Sparrow Mask, which was also spoiled during the Feast of Hemlock Vale preview article, you can take a horror and you can trigger both his card draw and the Sparrow Mask to get a boost on a future skill test as well. So you can double dip. Yeah, as someone who plays predominantly solo, this is the version of Hank that I was immediately drawn to. Having that stat line is pretty amazing. One of the issues you often run into when you're playing solo with survivors, they tend to have average to below average intellect, so you have to spend a lot of your deck slots just trying to get clues. Now, fortunately, survivors have plenty of ways to do that with cards like Old Keyring and Flashlight and Look What I Found and Lucky and stuff like that. But having to build around that weakness gets kind of tiring after a while, because you have to play basically the same cards in every survivor deck to make up for that weakness. Hank, you have, I think, a few more options to explore. If you were to flip fairly quickly, you could actually have a chance of just finding clues with his 3 intellect, so you can put different cards in your deck to explore other options of Hank. And obviously having the 4 combat is fantastic. You're starting off with 5, you can kill enemies, and then even when you flip, you still have a pretty good chance of killing enemies, and with 4 agility, the ones you don't want to kill, you have a pretty good chance of evading them, which I tend to use a lot in when I'm playing solo, because evading an enemy once and getting rid of it is a lot more efficient than spending 2 or 3 actions to try to take it down. As long as you can stay ahead of the enemies, you're in pretty good shape.
Yeah, and I think in most cases, in most Hank decks, you're probably looking at either Peter Sylvester or Jessica Hyde to kind of compensate for the fact that you don't have healing on your resolute side. They can kind of take the brunt of the damage for you, while Hank can take whatever he wants to take. Like in this case, he wants to take a bit of horror so that he can draw some extra cards, and you can use Peter to kind of stave off whatever you don't want to take. And then, Peter also gives you the agility boost, so like you really have like a 5 at that point, and that's usually enough to evade whatever you want to evade.
Yeah, and the nice thing with Peter is that, say you get hit for 2 horror, Peter can take 1 and heal that at the end of your turn, and then Hank can take the other, and then you're just one Elder Sign away from dumping that horror back on Peter, who will then heal it away. So you can manage your sanity that way, and not as long as you can get an Elder Sign. And I think in a game, typically you might get one or two, depending on how lucky you are. Of course, if you're Nate or Vase, you're never going to see an Elder Sign, so that doesn't really work when they're playing. But
Wrong.
That's why he
Father
plays Mateo, so he can explicitly see at least one per game.
Yep. Guaranteed, my friend.
Yeah, so I think it raises an interesting question: is do you play Peter to give you kind of more leverage in how you draw cards, or do you play Jessica because you're afraid of taking a bunch of damage? And I think that question really comes down to what campaign are you playing. Because in a campaign like Innsmouth, you might want Jessica because that campaign deals a crap ton of damage out. But in something like Carcosa, you might want Peter because that campaign is notorious for dealing 99 horror to you. So
yeah, I think it really depends on the campaign. I feel as though, and I think it depends on the campaign and whether there's a lot of treacheries that have the potential to deal damage. With Hank having, say, 5 combat at first and then 4 later on this side, I think you can either kill most enemies or evade most enemies, especially if you've got Peter adding another agility, and then of course Hank can play the track shoes to get another and boost his movement, so you can basically stay away from the enemies. So it really depends. If you're getting tagged by damage from treacheries, that's a threat, especially, and of course direct damage is awful for Hank. That's like your worst case scenario. Is then you've got to be exceedingly careful.
I know he can't be healed, but is there some kind of trick or workaround to clearing damage or sanity tokens through any means?
No, I don't think so. His signature card does let you move damage and horror from Hank to an enemy. So he does always have that in his back pocket, but yeah, it's pretty much like once the damage and horror is on your resolute side, it's not going away.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and also that signature card letting you move damage to an enemy, you have to be engaged, or you have to be in a location of an enemy. If treacheries are dealing this damage and there are no enemies, what are you going to do? Right. And you have to pull that card at the right moment. It's
or
really
have it in
hard
your
to make.
hand waiting.
Yeah, it's hard to make that one work. So yeah, like Nate said, it's once it's on there, it's going to be really hard to get rid of.
Yeah, I'm going to spoil his backside a little bit here, but Hank can play a card like I've had Worst Level 2 to cancel the damage before he takes it and get resources out of the deal. He can also play Ward of Protection. So if you don't want to deal with a treachery, you can just cancel it outright for a horror. So on this side, if you're playing this version of Hank, canceling something that potentially deals damage to you for a horror is not a terrible idea.
The hard part with Hank is you're really building for 2 completely separate play styles. Your initial face is so different. So if you have something like Ward of Protection on this face, it's great because not only do you prevent the treachery from happening, you're also going to draw a card because of his ability, because you're taking the horror, so you're drawing a card. It's really good. I mean, Ward of Protection is always a good card, so even if you have to use it on your other side, but there are other cards that may not be as useful. I don't know. I feel like sometimes you may be drawing more dead draws initially if you're building towards a particular side of Hank. If you got cards specifically to work with one of his different sides, it's going to be really difficult early in the game when you're pulling cards that are not as useful. So for example, let's say you're committed to playing the assistant side where your intellect gets bumped up to 3 and you get a lot of cards that help boost intellect to help you investigate. When you're on your initial side, your intellect is 1. No matter how many cards you have to boost that intellect, at best you're getting to average by boosting it, So those cards are dead draws until you flip his side. So you're going to have to really figure out your strategy going into any given scenario and going in blind, it's going to be even harder. But you have to figure out your strategy. Do you want to flip them quickly, or do you want to build your deck to support that first phase for a little bit, as well as the second phase, and maybe dilute the deck a little bit? It's kind of an interesting conundrum building for this guy.
I think that sort of should lead us into the other Resolute side, right, Cameron?
Yes. Hank Samson, the Warden, has 4 willpower, 1 intellect, 6 combat, and 3 agility. So our first investigator in the game, sporting a 6 in any stat, I believe, and 6 combat will certainly go a long way if you're fighting enemies with average fight values. You're already 3 up before the poll, so that's not too bad. Warden and Resolute traits bonded with Hank Samson. You cannot be healed. You may be assigned damage and horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. As a response, when 1 or more damage is placed on you, you gain 2 resources, and his Elder Sign effect is +1 move a damage from Hank Samson to an asset you control, and his health and sanity are reversed. So he has 6 health and 4 sanity in this case. Thoughts on Hank the Giant Killer here?
This was the Resolute version of Hank that I initially was drawn towards, because 6 combat is a lot, right? And you're thinking most Guardians, they have a weapon that gives them another +3. They're rocking a 9, 10, 11, 12 maybe even. But survivors don't really have a lot of weapons that give you a big combat boost or a big damage boost. So you kind of need 6 in some regard. Some bigger bosses, it'll still be a challenge, I think, to kill them, because Survivor's damage output is not Guardian damage output, simply put. So the 6, I feel, is pretty nice, and you maintain that 1 intellect. So I think it makes your deck building a bit more streamlined. Where you're thinking, okay, I'm going to always have 1 intellect. I'm never going to concern myself with investigating in a traditional sense. I'll forego that entirely and focus much more on combat. And I think 4 willpower is also really, really big.
Yeah, with having only 4 sanity, the 4 willpower gives him a little bit of resilience against, say, even a typical Rotting Remains.
Mm-hmm.
You're 4 versus 3, and you're likely going to be packing cards like Guts at least to try to boost yourself up, so you don't accidentally get tagged by 3 horror, especially if you're early in the game and you haven't have any allies set up to potentially soak that for you.
Yeah, I agree with Nate. This one is definitely more streamlined as far as deck building. If you're playing in a team and you're going to be the tank and the guy that's fighting the enemies, then it's much easier to build a deck around this phase, because like you said, I mean, you're already starting with a pretty good combat score on your other phase. So when it flips, you're just getting stronger, and you're just doubling down on what you've already built for, which is combat.
And his worst combat stat at any point is a 4.
Yeah,
which is awesome.
Yeah, exactly. So it's still pretty good. But going back to the assistant one, you're probably not building that deck if you're going to the other phase, the assistant phase. You're not going to build that deck fully for combat. Whereas the Warden one, you more than likely are. You're really hyper focused. I think the other face is definitely better for playing solo. This face is very hyper-focused.
This face would be you grab a sledgehammer and you just bash the shit out of everything that comes into your way.
Yep.
Which I think would be pretty satisfying personally. But that's kind of where I was at, Vase. Is this is streamlined. It feels like a natural path for the deck to take. Whereas when you build for the assistant side, you are kind of having to really consider when am I going to investigate. There's a lot more forethought that you have to put into a deck like that. It's definitely doable, and I think like Nathan had said earlier, is that what's cool about Hank is that you get the flexibility for free, right? Where maybe you're playing in Miskatonic, for example, and you go to the museum, right? There's only 1 enemy in that scenario. So it's maybe you go to the assistant side for that scenario and you play on that side where the 4 combat is probably going to be enough, right? And then you happen to also get the ability to investigate every once in a while, right? but then you play, say, another scenario that has a ton of enemies, and then you go to the Warden side, and now you're ready to kick some ass. And that flexibility is really nice, and it is kind of a struggle on which do you build for generally. Do you build for the assistant side and try to go that route? Like, Man from Lang was saying, maybe in solo you do that, but maybe in 3-4 player you're going more towards the Warden side and you're trying to mostly kill enemies.
You can also do a hybrid build, right, between the two.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of balance
Absolutely.
it. I think that the assistant side, he should be now wearing glasses or holding a book. And I think on the other side, he should be slightly green, like Lou Ferrigno. I mean, hear me out. Now, in Spirit Island, if anyone has played that board game, you play as the spirits fighting against the colonists that are trying to destroy the land. So it's kind of the opposite of Catan, kind of a Moana feel. And in the first expansion for that called Jagged Earth, there is a spirit called Stars Without Form. It starts off weak, but with every ability. And as you play, you get to trim stuff away that you don't need. So if you need something that's more offensive, you trim away the utility and the defensive, et cetera, et cetera. And that's who, when I read Hank and his ability to shift his stats and kind of, once again, just to what you're needing at the time. Aside from Man from Lang's great point of, being attracted to the solo side because it's got the even stat line, I do like the fact that you always have options. You're not just stuck with the same stats when things go sideways and you get swarmed with creatures, or if clearly, even though you have a clover, or maybe the clover dies, oops, you're not strung out. You have options on how you can still best help your group.
It's a good point. I mean, you might change your mind halfway through the scenario based on if someone went out earlier or something. Yeah. I also like that he's not super complex, even though it seems complex, initially. It's just a quick, flip. Like there are some investigators that like take a lot of management and that kind of thing, but for Hank, I feel like despite the fact that he is rather complex in terms of your deck building and all that, once you start playing, it's pretty straightforward.
He feels like one of those investigators that's really simple to understand but really hard to master, which is just mwah.
Yeah.
That's
Well, let's take a look at Hank's deck building options, which hopefully haven't been spoiled yet. Hank Samson the farmhand has a deck size of 35, so slightly larger than the traditional deck size of 30. His deck building options are survivor cards level 0 to 5, neutral cards level 0 to 5, up to 10 other innate and or spirit cards level 0 to 2. His deck building requirements include his signatures, Stouthearted, Wears Paw, his signature weakness, and one random basic weakness. Now, I had, in my preview video for Hank Samson, I had him pinned as a survivor/guardian. I thought he might have access to survivor cards level, 0 to 2, or guardian cards level 0 to 2. Primarily because he does have sort of a very Guardian-esque ability. Now, I did take a look at some of the cards that he has available. Give me a second.
Yeah, as far as spirit cards go, he gets a lot of interesting options in the spirit trait. I think the innate trait is the one that you'll probably quickly find like 3 or 4 that you wanna include, things like quick thinking. Let's see what else here. You've got like quick thinking.
So as far as innate cards go, level 0 to 2, he's got in Guardian, there's cards like Daring, which is obviously pretty awesome. If you're playing with allies, you've got Inspiring Presence and then Steadfast. So those are 3 pretty decent skills. Right. There's also Helping Hand, but I think that one's a little more difficult to use, and Intrepid, which I don't think sees a bunch of play. In Seeker, he has Curiosity, Eureka, of course, which is a pretty amazing card. Fae, level 1, which is a curse card, so Hank's probably not playing with that. And then, of course, you've got Inquiring Mind. So if there's a skill, if there's a clue at your location, there's 3 wild skill icons, which is pretty awesome. In Rogue, there's Cunning, Manual Dexterity level 2, Nimble, both levels of Opportunist, Quick Thinking, and Savant. Obviously, the strong one here is Quick Thinking, so he can get some extra actions, but Savant level 1 in the Balanced Hank, that's 3 extra wild skill icons for a total of 4, which is pretty hard to turn your nose up at.
Mm-hmm.
Mystic cards, there is Accursed, which is one of the cards that was spoiled for the Feast of Hemlock Vale. It just happened to be up on ArkhamDB. I believe that deals with curse tokens, so Hank's probably not all that interested in that. There's both levels of Defiance. Again, probably not playing those. There's Fearless, which I believe heals horror, so he's not playing those. Ghastly Possession plays around, is from the Scarlet Keys and plays around with Doom. He's probably not playing that. And then there's Guts level 2, which if you are concerned about passing willpower skill tests, that could definitely be a big boon. So as far as innate cards go, there aren't, I think most, if not all of them, are skills. So the ones that really stand out to me are like Daring and Steadfast, Inquiring Mind, Quick Thinking, and Savant and Guts level 2. And then, of course, you've got there are many innate cards that are survivor cards, but he gets those anyway, so you don't have to worry about those.
Yeah, so Savant is the interesting one, I think, of the lot. It's like, if you plan to play more of the Warden side of Hank, then Savant is probably not worth it, especially because it's basically just Unexpected Courage on his base form as well. But if you plan to go more into the assistant route, Savant becomes really good, and you're probably considering that more. And that's like kind of a really interesting aspect of Hank, is like just cards like that become really, like, the value of them vastly differs between your base form and your resolute form, and that's wicked cool.
Yeah, and you've got a card like Eureka as well, which is, it's one of the best seeker cards in the game, and the fact that Hank can commit that and then search his deck for something, at that point you could almost even get away without having to play that weapon tutor. If you've got Eureka able to search your top 3 cards of your deck for a weapon if you need it. Daring, I think you get to add your agility to your combat, which in Hank is
Daring just gives you a flat 3 wild icons.
Is it just flat 3?
Yeah. So you can use it with his already amazing combat, or use it to evade something.
Yeah, so there are some very strong skills with the innate trait, but there aren't a great many of them in Guardian, Seeker, Rogue, or Mystic that Hank will be all that interested in. Now, if Hank also gets Spirit cards level 0 to 2, most of which are Guardian cards, which we will look at in a second. There is one Seeker card with the Spirit trait, that's Ghastly Revelation, which Hank won't be playing. That's the one where you can basically be defeated and drop all your clues. And
I don't know. I could see a situation where you play that, right? It's like, if you're already gonna die, you have no way of healing anyway, you're like, yeah, screw it. And you take the trauma, and it's like, taking trauma might play into your game plan. I don't know. I could see it. I wouldn't be like super excited about it, but I could definitely see a situation where you might want something like that, because you're trying to like actively take trauma so that you can maybe play desperate cards, and you're playing like desperate cards and this, and you're trying to always like kind of have that engine online.
Yeah, Hank is definitely interested in the desperate suite of skills from Echoes of the Past that were reprinted in the Path to Carcosa Investigator expansion, because you can trigger that pretty damn quickly if you only have either 4 health or 4 sanity. In Rogue, we have I'm Outta Here, which is an interesting option. There are certain scenarios that are completely nerfed by I'm Outta Here, so that might be something worth considering if you need to resign. Rheostrat is a curse card, probably not in Hank's wheelhouse. There are a couple in Mystic. There are both levels of Eldritch Inspiration. Hank's probably not interested in those. Meditative Trance, I believe, heals, which he won't be playing. Uncage the Soul. Hank's not playing any spells, so that's probably not happening either. Winds of Power as charges. He's probably not worried about that. And then, of course, you've got Ward of Protection level 0 and level 2, which... Ward of Protection is one of the best cards in the game. You do have to take a horror, so you may not want to be playing that if you're planning on going the 6 combat version of Hank, but if you're playing the other version, taking a horror in order to either prevent a treachery that is going to hurt you or prevent a treachery that's going to hurt other players at the table isn't a bad option. As far as the Guardian Spirit cards, there are a whole bunch of very good ones that Hank is interested in. You've got Get Behind Me, which was released in the Edge of the Earth. You've got Get Over Here if you need to engage enemies, both versions of that. There's I'll See You in Hell if you want to take some trauma. There's I've Had Worse level 2, which allows you to cancel damage and horror before you take it and gain resources, which is really good. Let Me Handle This lets him pull enemies and take treacheries from other players if necessary. There's a bunch of combat options in like Clean Them Out, Counterpunch level 2. We've got some duds like Heroic Rescue and Mano a Mano, probably not playing those. But you've got Monster Slayer, so if you want to do a bunch of damage. And you've got Stand Together, which is very good in multiplayer. And Sweeping Kick, which lets Hank add his agility to his combat skill value, deal a bonus damage, and evade an enemy. So some pretty attractive cards in the Spirit level 0 to 2 Guardian pile for Hank to play around with.
Yeah, I think toe-to-toe, if you're going the combat route, is appealing to you as well. If you're on your Resolute side, you can like take a damage, gain 2 resources, play this card, deal 2 damage. That feels pretty cool. I think that the Spirit trait feels very fitting. I think like as far as what he wants to be doing with his card pool, it feels very complementary to his overall game plan. I think on both sides, right? You can play the sort of damage mitigating route with things like I've Had Worse and Delay the Inevitable, and then once you get to that critical mass, you could play like Fight or Flight, and then Fight or Flight gives you this huge boost when you need it. You could go more into like Test of Wills and Wards of Protection, maybe play the Assistant if you wanted to like be more of a support role. I think Hank could do that pretty competently as well. It's like maybe you play some sort of like backup fighter character who has sort of like Wards of Protection and can evade things pretty well and can occasionally also get clues with like look what I found and stuff like that. So now that we know like what Hank, like all of his deck building capabilities, like what sort of cards stand out to you guys as far as like Hank cards?
Ooh. For me, it's allies. I like allies. I mean, the list of Spirit and Innate and Spirit cards that Man from Lang read, there's so many good ones. I mean, it really depends. It's like Nathan said earlier. He's so versatile in how you can build them that there's no like one card that's like, oh, this is definitely a Hank card. It's like, it really depends on how you build them.
Yeah, I think the cards he has access to give him basically everything he needs, especially if you're playing him as a fighter. You've got cards like Get Over Here to engage enemies off of other investigators or engage enemies that are far away from you. He's got damage mitigation, and I've had worse. He's got an ability to protect the group and let me handle this. If you need a little bit more combat than just having a pure 6, you've got cards like Counterpunch and 1-2 Punch, where you can really dish out a lot of damage in a short amount of time. And then cards like Sweeping Kick as well is pretty good for him. I mean, you're not going to miss all that often if you're sweeping kicking something.
Mm-mm.
And if you're able to, say, if you're playing multiplayer and you can sweeping kick a boss, chances are Hank is going to hit the boss and then automatically evade it as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then everybody else can pile on and attack without too much worry of being retaliated against is pretty nice.
I think a card that interests me in Hank is Brute Force, which I know isn't like the most exciting card, but since he already has like a 5 or a 6 base combat, you go up to like a 7 or even an 8, and then you deal 3 damage off a skill. That seems really good as well. Because survivors don't have a ton of ways of dealing burst damage like that. And so if you could, save some of your more precious like Spirit and Innate slots for other things, then having a card like a Brute Force might be pretty useful. I would think like Cherished Keepsake would even be useful in Hank as well. Those like Leather Coat, Cherished Keepsake, those soak items that survivors have access to are probably pretty good as well. Since he can't heal, he can always take more soak. It would be nice if he had access to the Guardian soak cards as well, but such is life. I think some other standouts. I've had worse has to be one of the best cards for him. I think that card seems really good. Face, you had mentioned Eucatastrophe as well.
Obviously, Eucatastrophe is a great card for any investigator who has a great Elder Sign ability, but he really needs it. He's especially once he flips, like getting that Elder Sign is the way to heal. It's one of the only ways to heal, really. And you got his signature card, but that's not always super useful, or it may come out at the wrong time. So really, Eucatastrophe is a way to like prevent that last bit of, type of thing. So I really think that's a key card once he gets enough experience for him.
Maybe experience he could earn through his pelt shipments. Boom.
That's right.
No skin off my back.
Well, he is a farmer at heart, so he can, lots of cow pelts and whatnot that he no longer needs.
Mm-hmm. I like Fire Axe in him too. If you're playing the Warden side, like Fire Axe plus his ability to gain more resources, pretty cool.
Yeah, and I'm sure, these are just cards that we have currently available. I'm actually kind of surprised he has full access to the Survivor card pool. I thought they would maybe limit him a little bit, but he has access to every Survivor card, and then plus all the Survivor cards that are going to be in Feast of Hemlock Vale. So what was spoiled in the preview article, there's that pitchfork that you can throw and then pick up, deal a ton of damage to enemies that way. There's Baseball Bat. There's the Fire Axe, like you mentioned. Chainsaw, I think comes on later. There's the Sledgehammer as well. So Hank can definitely dish out a lot of punishment without having to dip into the Guardian weapons. I am a little disappointed that he can't take the boxing gloves, but that's just primarily because his signature card shows him in a boxing pose, and so it seems like that would be fitting. And of course, boxing gloves works very well with the spirit cards.
Man from Lang, he can't wear boxing gloves because he is a bare knuckle fighter, my friend. Look at his boxing stance.
So he can't take brass knuckles either?
No, bare knuckle fighter.
Well, but you could
legally.
pick up that neutral card to get boxing gloves into the deck if you wanted to, which might actually be worthwhile because it does allow you to pull spirit cards. So if you have enough spirit cards in your deck, it might be worthwhile increasing your deck size slightly to wedge a couple copies of boxing gloves in there, so you can both fight a little bit better and then search for those spirit cards that you need to dish out more damage.
One thing, since you mentioned upping your deck size slightly, one thing to think about, his deck size is already bigger than the average, right? Because it's 35.
I think that might be because of his draw ability on the one side.
Probably, yeah.
So he can draw through his deck a little bit easier than most survivors can, where draw is a little bit weaker.
I'm looking through the survivor cards now. Perseverance is a card I would consider in Hank too.
Oh yeah, that's a good card.
Be able to cancel that damage and horror that's about to kill you. Precious Memento, Composures even. You might consider something like Plucky in Hank. For one, the stat boost, and two, that extra bit of soak that you can put on something else before you have to deal it to Hank. That might be useful. Protective Gear even, if you wanted to go really ham into that sort of thing.
I mean, there's so many routes you can take with him. On the one flip side, I mean, you can go to take deliberate damage or deliberate horror or damage to draw cards. There's just so many ways to build them. I really like investigators that have so many open options and still be effective.
So on a scale of 1 elder sign to 5 elder signs, 1 being least, 5 being most, of course, how many elder signs are you looking forward to playing Hank Simpson?
I'm thinking 4. He looks really cool.
Seems fun. I go with 4 as well.
I think I'll say 5.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fact that you have 2 different options to play, you're
it's
sort
really
of getting
cool.
You're sort of getting 2 investigators in one with him, and you can explore quite a few different builds, even just with Hank.
Yep, I would say 4 myself. I was going to say 4 before anybody said anything. So I'm surprised that we're all on a 4 to 5 elder sign level here.
I feel like FFG knew us as players when they gave us Hank as an investigator.
Right.
They're these guys simple yet complex at the same time, and Hank is really kind of he fills that niche really well.
He really does. Yeah.
Now, the preview article for Hank Samson also spoiled his signature cards. We'll just take a look at them briefly here. His signature asset or his signature event is Stouthearted 2-cost event with a willpower, combat, and wild skill icon. So you can potentially get 2 willpower or 2 combat, depending on what you need. It has the spirit trait, which again is why I thought he might be able to play the boxing gloves, because then you could fish this out of your deck, which would be awesome. Hank Samson deck only. Fast play: when you engage a non-elite enemy, move up to 2 damage and or horror from Hank Samson to that enemy as damage. So here's Hank's way to heal. Basically, once per game, if you can draw this, you can move a little bit of damage and or horror.
Why once per game?
Well, if you play, unless you have some way of getting it back. And because it is a signature card that isn't it's not a survivor card, so Hank can't get it back the traditional ways.
Yeah.
So basically would have
I'd try to get that puppy back.
You'd have to cycle your deck, which might be possible with Hank's extra
They
card
made it
draw.
harder by making it 35.
But they made it harder when they boosted his deck size. So you're not going to get to play this often, but 2 damage and or horror isn't bad.
With that card, so my thoughts on it are, you may get 1 use out of it throughout the entire campaign. I think I'm not being hyperbolic here, because you have to have the 2 resources at the time when you need it. You have to have it in hand or draw it at the right time. You have to use it at the moment you engage the enemy. The enemy cannot be elite, and you need to at least have those 2 damage or horror. I mean, you can have 1 if you want, but why waste this on 1 damage or horror? So you're going to be on a flip side, so you have a very small window there of damage or horror that you're going to want to move. You have to have the 2 resources. You have to do it only when you engage that enemy. So you could be fighting that enemy, draw the card on your turn, while you're already in the middle of fighting him, too late. It just seems like there's a lot going
Too
on here
conditional
that's
for
going to
you.
make it difficult to make this card as useful. It's definitely a necessity in Hank once he flips, because it's one of the few ways he can get rid of damage or horror, but there's so many like constraints to using it that I have a feeling it's going to be like a once per campaign use.
I mean, that being said, like, I think Nathan has a decent point there. Like, you could easily evade an enemy, and then, during enemy phase, it re-engages you, and you play it during enemy phase, and you could, like, get the damage off you that way. Like, I think that is possible, should you need it. And I think in the situations you're going to need it, you're probably swarmed, so you evade one enemy, and then you go and kill something else, and then during enemy phase, that thing re-engages you. You play Stouthearted, and now you're in an okay spot. But I do think that Vase is mostly right, and that situation probably won't come up very often.
It also
But
prevents Dark Horse decks. Like I was thinking, like initially Dark Horse would be great for the balanced stat line version, the
Mhm.
Warden stat line. But come to think of it, like, if you need the two is a lot to pay for this, right? So if you're playing Dark Horse, you're not playing this card. Something else to think about. I
Mhm.
wish it cost a little less. Like one resource, I think it still would have been okay and not like a game breaking card.
It does have good icons at least. So, if you find yourself with it in your hand at the end of the game, you pitch it for two good icons, and it's sort of that insurance policy, which, like you said, Vase, is important to have. So you're gonna be glad that you drew it, just whether or not you use it to actually save yourself.
Insurance policy. But yeah, that's the other thing. It's like if a treachery is the one, it's the thing that's going to take out your damage or horror. This is
Mhm.
there are scenarios with less enemies and more treachery. So
I would like to point out to those who claimed that Hank is a bare knuckle fighter, he is clearly wearing gloves in his art. So,
Those are for like doing the farm work. Why would you?
yeah.
okay, that's a good point. He is definitely wearing gloves.
So why can't he wear boxing gloves and use a pitchfork? I don't see why that's not possible.
It's so hard to grab a pitchfork while wearing boxing gloves,
But
or
it is
or any
possible.
gardening tool. It is possible, I guess. Yeah.
So what about his signature weakness?
Hank's signature weakness is Where's Paw. It has the Flaw trait. Revelation: discard cards from the top of the encounter deck until an enemy is discarded. Attach Where's Paw to that enemy and spawn it at a connecting location if able. Attached enemy gains elusive. Forced at the end of the round, Hank Samson takes one direct horror. Now, has the elusive keyword been spoiled?
I don't believe so.
So we don't know what elusive does. Elusive has been used in other Arkham Files games. Typically, it's like something it wouldn't engage. I sort of believe it may be like the enemy spawns and then Hank will actually have to move to that enemy and take an action to engage it. It just won't engage him automatically, which would make sense because that would sort of add up to 2 actions worth of effort for Hank, which is generally what basic weaknesses or signature weaknesses cost, is 2 actions. Now this one, if you're playing, if you're playing fighting Hank, man, oh man, you're going to need to deal with this fast. Or you are in deep trouble. One direct horror per turn is no joke.
Yeah, I think this weakness alone might have you reconsider mid-game which resolute form you take. Because it's like, if you can't deal with the enemy, you might be like, crap, like I have to go into the assistant form so that I survive long enough.
Yeah, I mean, the elusive keyword is the key here. Knowing what that does is going to make this a really, really bad treachery, or somewhat bad. It's still bad regardless, but say you're Hank and it's your second action and you drew a card somehow, whether, a card gave you a card or something, and you draw this. Now you're almost out of actions, or let's say that's your third action. You're out of actions. You are taking one direct horror already. And depending on what this elusive thing does, what if the elusive makes the enemy move one location away from you as well? So then now you're talking brutal because you're guaranteed to take 2. You're not going to kill this thing in the next round.
Yeah.
So that could be a very, very brutal card to get once you flip.
Plus, Hank has so little sanity for the most part. It's like you could draw this, take a direct horror, draw an auto fail. Oh, you're dead.
Yeah, it could be really, really bad. So definitely brutal. The fact that it's direct, I mean, this might be too harsh. And again, it depends on what elusive is going to be. Quick note about the artwork. It is fantastic. It is probably my second favorite artwork in Arkham Horror. I think it really portrays just the despair that he has by seeing what's happening here. And just seeing the, whatever's behind this obstruction. I mean, it's really, really cool. And the angle, too, adds to, like, the impact of it. Like, just the slight angle that it was drawn, or the illustration is, the point of view is, it's great. It just...
With that contrast of, like, the door being open outside with the, like, dark foreground. Yeah, it's great.
It's so good. And then he dropped his hammer there next to him. Like, just, you could see what happened. Like, he saw what he's seeing, drops it, and just runs and puts his hands on his face in absolute horror and despair. It's great. It speaks volumes. I love it.
It's really going to depend on what that elusive keyword does, but Hank does have access to Get Over Here, which, just as a reminder, you can engage, fight, choose a non-elite enemy at your location or a connecting location, move that enemy to your location, engage it, and attack it. Depending what elusive does, Get Over Here might be Hank's best friend.
At least this one, like, yeah, it hits you right in your weak spot, but it also sort of exemplifies what Hank is good at, which is a really good balance in design with a weakness. As
a solo player who has a preference for the 6 sanity Hank, this one doesn't feel quite as bad, especially since you can, if you're playing with Peter Sylvester to heal horror, you can, and then if you can get an Elder Sign, even if you do take direct horror from this, you can potentially move it around a little bit. And Hank's signature event does help here as well. Like, if you can move horror to enemies as well. So if you do get unlucky and, say, have to take a couple of direct horror and you're near death, then you can move that horror off Hank to an enemy. I should note that Get Over Here only works on non-elite enemies, so depending on what elusive does, if you draw an elite enemy off the top of the discard, man, that would be frustrating to say the least, because then suddenly it's like, oh, I had this plan to deal with the enemy, and now it doesn't work. But we'll have to wait and see what elusive does before we can actually say just how bad Where His Paw is. If it just costs you an extra action to engage an enemy, okay, not too bad. If it forces that enemy to move away from you, that's potentially a lot worse. If you've got to chase some enemy across the map, holy cow, that'd be
very annoying.
That would be very annoying. At least it's not like Zoe's weakness, Smite the Wicked, where the enemy spawns far across the map, and then you would have to go chase it down. That would be, I think Hank would be dead long before he got there.
And just as a heads up, I mean, elusive, we do know what it does. That's disengage from each enemy with you and move to reveal location with no enemies. So, enemies are going to be running around the board. It's going to be crazy. They're all going to be rogues.
That would be brutal. It probably is something like that, right? Where it's like, you hit the enemy and then it disengages and moves. Oh, God, that would be so annoying.
Yeah, especially with that weakness, that can make or break your turn.
It's kind of like the Rougarou from the Rougarou scenario, where it's like every time you hit the Rougarou, it moves away. It's like, God, that thing is so annoying.
Yeah.
This is definitely something you're going to have to take into account when you are building your Hank Samson deck, because when you've only got 4 sanity or 6 sanity, you're not going to have... I mean, the other option is, of course, you wait until Where's Paw has popped before you flip.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that might be best case. Like, you draw this early in the game, you take a bunch of direct horror. Okay, I die, I flip, I deal with the enemy before, after that sort of thing. So that, I think, wouldn't be too bad. But yeah, getting this late game where you may not necessarily have the time to go be chasing enemies around. That's going to do it for our look at the Hank Samson Investigator cards. I have to say cards because there's a whole bunch of them. There's his basic card, his two bonded versions, and then we took a look at Hank's deck building options as well. Let us know in the comments down below what you think about Hank Samson. Are you looking forward to playing the new Survivor Investigator from the Feast of Hemlock Vale? Special thanks to Fantasy Flight Games for providing the spoilers. It is always appreciated. Any final thoughts about Hank Samson and his bonded cards and or deck building options?
I am very excited to play Hank. He looks like a lot of fun.
You stole my word. I was going to say, very exciting investigator.
Those have both been stolen from me. Also excited.
That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromlang@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromlang. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your other sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.